Today, I wanted to talk about why and how to keep a sketchbook. And when I talk about a sketchbook, it doesn't have to be anything fancy. It can be something cheaper, and honestly, I would recommend that you do get something cheaper if the thought of using a sketchbook is intimidating to you in the first place. A lot of you have told me that you prefer to use loose sheets of paper for your sketching, which is also fine. And if you take that approach, obviously you can choose what you save or don't save. But the reason I think it's a good idea to keep a sketchbook, whether it's a bound book or a collection of loose sheets in a folder or binder, is because I think it can be really useful to you to be able to go and look back at your sketches and doodles and thoughts on paper that you've created over time. Not only will you be able to see how you've grown and changed in your practice, but you will likely find some great ideas in your old sketchbooks. I have been really surprised at some of the things I've discovered, especially the further I look back. I think part of the reason for this is that sometimes we just need our creative work to just sort of sit and marinate for a while. I think it's harder to make an accurate judgment about how we really feel about our own work the fresher it is in our memory, or at least that's what I find a lot of times. So if you make something and you kind of put it away and then maybe even forget about it and come back to it, it'll probably be a lot easier to discover how you really feel about it. And while there are a lot of things I look back on and don't necessarily care for, I think the gems that you do find are definitely worth it. There are, of course, lots of other reasons as to why you might want to keep a sketchbook, like having a dedicated place to practice or experiment, having something to do other than scroll, etc. But I think that record of your work is a really important point that sometimes gets overlooked, which is why I wanted to emphasize that. So, how should you use your sketchbook? There is no one correct way to use a sketchbook. It is entirely up to the person using it. But these are just some ideas that guide my personal practice, so use them or not, whatever works best for you. First, I'm generally not very interested in how my pages will end up looking. As a side note, I actually have been thinking of starting more of an art book where the pages are a little more planned out, I guess. But when it comes to everyday working sketchbooks, the end result to me is mostly incidental. I use it as a tool rather than a portfolio. So when I'm using my sketchbook, my objective is to practice, experiment, and learn. For me, it's really important to allow myself to make a mess. I'm not saying you have to try to make a mess. I'm not saying you should intentionally make drawings that you think are ugly. I'm just saying that it may work in your favor to let things happen as they happen. When I'm trying to figure things out, I just have to put my pen or pencil to paper and let it work out visually, which often means stuff isn't always tidy or very planned out. So especially when working in a notebook, I think it's helpful to create for the process rather than the outcome. It's not that the finished work isn't important, but if you're working toward learning or improving your art, just don't be too attached to the outcome. But that being said, when I do feel that freedom to create whatever, I almost always end up really enjoying the final product anyway. But what if I end up with a page or drawing I really hate? I usually just leave it. Nobody has to see it. And I'm always glad I did this. There have been many times when I've drawn something I thought was really ugly or stupid, but I left it alone. And years later, I'm glad to see it because it's either usually not as bad as I thought, or I can at least get a giggle out of it. Of course, with your sketchbook, if something is truly very distressing, you can absolutely cover it or rip it out. But I feel it's good to make a habit out of keeping as much as you can. And this brings me to another tip, which is to write the date on your pages so you know when you were working on something. There are so many times when I wish I would have written a date or at least the year on some pages. I have some really old sketchbooks and I have no idea what was going on at that time. And to know the date would add another layer of interest because it can add a lot more context to your work. And in that same vein, don't be shy about journaling in your sketchbook or just making small notes or writing down silly poems. If you have a very specific goal as far as what you want to work on, definitely go for that. But if you're not sure, don't be afraid to try lots of different things. Try out different materials, tools, and techniques. You don't have to limit yourself to one type of medium or one theme or one style. Of course, if you stumble on something you really love, you can just zero in on that. But To get started, it's okay to put anything down. Try different types of shading, or try holding your pen in different ways. Make swatches and thumbnails, sketches, do full page, fully completed drawings, or just do a doodle each day. You can also do master studies where you copy the work of an artist you admire or want to emulate. There's nothing wrong with replicating somebody's work for practice. If you do choose to share it with others, you should definitely credit the original artist and make it very clear that the work is not really yours and was created for learning purposes. But trying to create a work you love is an excellent way to better understand the processes of other artists. I would note that even though it's great to mix styles and mediums within a sketchbook, a practical exception to this is when you're using a medium that doesn't work well with the paper. For example, it can be difficult to use watercolor on regular old drawing paper. If you're going for the crinkly look, it's fine, but if not, it's good to know your paper's limitations. And that brings me to my next point. I always have several sketchbooks in use, but not necessarily just because some different mediums require different papers. My main reason for working in multiple sketchbooks at a time is convenience, and it also means I rarely have an excuse to not draw. If you have one in your bag, one in your living room or kitchen or at your desk, it makes it easier to work wherever you are. And likewise, it can be helpful to have multiple pens, pencils, palettes, etc. as well. There is no right or wrong way to use your sketchbook. You can make your own rules or not. But I do hope this has been a helpful starting point. You have the freedom to create in any way you want because it is your sketchbook.